Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. It's Thursday, June 13th, and I'm Artist Arnold III. I'm a member of the City Club Board of Directors and also a managing director at the Huntington National Bank, as well as the youth minister for Bethany Baptist Church. I am grateful to be here to open our City Club Forum in partnership with the United Negro College Fund, Ohio. I want to extend our gratitude to Scott Hamilton, Area Development Director at UNCF, for his partnership. For 80 years, UNCF has been the nation's largest guiding light in propelling our nation's historically Black colleges and universities and underrepresented students forward. HBCUs educate and support the largest number of the nation's Black professionals and are anchors in our communities and families. Today, City Club is proud to partner with the UNCF to welcome our invited speaker this afternoon, Steve Phillips. In his latest book, How We Can Win the Civil War, Steve Phillips tackles a formidable foe, America's century-long struggle with racism. It's a follow-up to 2016's Brown is the New White. This time, Phillips argues that in order for this country to move forward and overcome white supremacy, we must resolve the issues that have lingered since the end of the Civil War. Phillips was born and raised right here in Cleveland Heights. He is a New York Times best-selling author and the founder of Democracy in Color, an organization focused on political strategy and analysis at the intersection of race and politics. He is also a regular contributor to The Nation and The Guardian. He is a graduate of Stanford University, University of California, San Francisco College of Law. Our MC today is Danita Harris, and she will moderate the conversation. If you have any questions for our speaker, you can text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. And the City Club staff will try to work it in to the second half of our program. Now, members, friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcome Steve Phillips. Danita?
All right. Steve, you ready?
I'm ready.
I think, first of all, can we just say welcome home? How does it feel to know that you're keynoting the UNCF Leadership Luncheon today? What were your thoughts?
Oh, well, first, it's great to be home, and so it's always good to come back to Cleveland. I am, as you mentioned, grew up in Cleveland Heights. Although I do not and have never dated Taylor Swift, but still proud to be from Cleveland Heights. And delighted to also be, I think, I should say, lead with for this gathering that I am the proud son of a graduate of Central State University. I want to shout out the sister from Central State who spoke earlier, and a proud brother of a graduate of Fisk University. So I'm definitely pleased to be with that. And I'm honored to be part, again, with the City Club, part of their entities. This is actually my third time. And then I want to shout out my family's here. My dad and my other relatives are here. And this first City Club speech I gave in 2014, I didn't have a tie clip, and so my dad gave me his tie clip. But I have one today, Dad, so I'm learning as we go forward here.
You know, where is your family? Family, stand up. This is a good moment. Where's your family? We want to acknowledge you. Thank you so much. Don't be shy. There they are. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dad, for the tie clip. Thank you for the tie clip. You know, so let's jump right into this. Your work, you focus a lot on politics, but you're also passionate about advocating for a democracy that's multiracial, multi-ethnic. I like that you wanted to be authentically inclusive, and I think that's a good word to put in front of inclusive. But how do you see the work of UNCF as part of that broader work of democracy building?
It's critical, right? We have to remember in so many different ways that it used to be illegal to teach African Americans to read, right? So the centrality of education to the enterprise of freedom and oppression has been a critical core component, in that one of the roles of people of color in general, African Americans in particular, has been to expand democracy within this country and to expand the availability of the services and that we have within our society. So at the end of the Civil War, there really was a question put to the whole country about, because the Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal, but it's a question of, does all mean all? And that we had not had education and we had not had higher education. And it really was Reconstruction and the efforts of the demands of the black community to provide education to everybody so that all people could actually move forward and advance in that regard. So the mission of what UNCF is doing has been core component of expanding democracy within this country and being able to move us closer to having an actual multiracial democracy where in fact we believe that all people are created equal.
And when it comes to supporting education efforts for black people, I'm just going to be specific, what is our nation doing right, and then what are we doing wrong?
So it's an issue in terms of, again, it comes back to this question, does all mean all? And do we really, so I had the opportunity and the privilege of saying, my mother was a graduate of Central State, and she was a teacher and a proud teacher in the Cleveland Public Schools for many years. And so it was very much imbued with the importance of education as a critical component of how we actually have to move forward, but also seeing that there's a real structural and systemic failure, and frankly a lack of will and commitment to make sure that everybody can actually have excellence. So I had the opportunity to serve on the school board in San Francisco for 8 years, and we tried to raise this question, and then what are the implications of having excellence for everybody? And so there's often this default to, well, some children are talented and gifted, other children are problematic and troublemakers. But that's not really what the data and the research shows, is that brilliance and excellence comes in all different facets and forms. And does the schools and do our education system recognize that? And is there then a cultural lens around the types of behavior, the types of attitudes that we resonate with and support versus in terms of helping to tap and unleash the level of expertise and brilliance that all people have? So the schools need to diversify and modernize their understanding around what quality education looks like, what excellence looks like, what's the cultural dimensions of that, because it manifests itself in many different fashions, and not be stuck, really frankly, in a 1950s mindset around what education looks like.
So I'm going to jump into the politics now. Former President Donald Trump, he said, and I quote, he claimed to have saved HBCUs during his time as president. Now, I would like for you to speak on, did his administration, what did they do for HBCUs? And then what do you feel the Biden administration, how are they faring when it comes to this?
Right. Well, the prior president is wrong, and wrong is as wrong as the Vice President Dan Quayle when he came to United Negro College Fund and said what a terrible thing it is to lose your mind, right? So, which he may have known something about. So, the most problematic and dangerous aspect of many dangerous aspects of what this prior president has done, and this is what I really try to outline. The fundamental argument and analysis to try to lay out in my book is that the Confederates have actually never stopped fighting since the end of the Civil War to keep this and make this fundamentally a white country. and to not have it become a multiracial democracy. And people forget that when Trump first ran, he was seen as kind of a joke in that he wasn't going to be viable, because people did not believe that that level of naked, unapologetic championing of white supremacy could be politically viable. And yet, here we are. And so the most dangerous thing is he has validated those people who want to whitewash history and who want to make this country and its institutions, its education institutions, all the way from K through higher education, into entities that take us back to this whole notion of what I call in my chapter in that, make America white again. And by the way, and I actually highly commend to people because one of the great dangers of this moment, and this year in particular, is the normalization of what has happened in the past period in time within this country, and the failure to recognize the severity of the threat that we face, both from a man and a movement that tried to overthrow the elected government of the United States of America on January 6, 2021. And I've been watching this Netflix special on Hitler and the rise of Hitler. And I did not know until watching this that in the rise of Hitler, his phrase, one of his main rallying cries, was "Make Germany great again." And so we need to see the moment that we're in and the intensity of that. So that's a long way of saying that what the prior president did very little for HBCUs in particular, but more fundamentally undermined the cause of specifically focusing in on the education of African Americans, and gave license to and unleashed people like Ron DeSantis in Florida, who's gone after HBCUs and tried to delegitimize them, and even the College Board has then tried to back off of a course and a curriculum specifically around African American history. That's all because of what has been unleashed by the prior president. This president, the current one, has done a much better job, starting with, not inconsequentially, and not even more than consequentially, does not get enough credit for, choosing a graduate of an HBCU to be his vice presidential nominee. So that we had breaking that barrier, showing the country, offering an example, offering a model. Choosing an African American woman to be on the United States Supreme Court, showing that model, showing that example. And this president has given, and has not been given enough credit for, he's given 2 or 3 significant speeches where he has talked about the unleashing of racism and white supremacy in this country and the attacks on democracy, and how great a threat that is to our nation. So to that regard, I do think that he's been significantly better certainly than the alternative been. There's always more that can and should be done. There's always reticence. This is the first book I wrote, Brown is the New White, was there showing that there's a greater appetite and majority support for aggressively moving towards making America a multiracial democracy. And so even on the issue, like after George Floyd was killed, we still could not even put forward a bill just to study the question of reparations. What is owed to a people who were held in slavery and who made this country rich without compensation to themselves? And so we have not grappled with what is owed. And so you can argue you can't get things through Congress, et cetera, but the president could create a presidential commission to study this issue, look at that, lend the level of legitimacy and credibility to that. So I would both urge him to do that, but also criticize that as a shortcoming they've had.
So as we are less than 6 months away from the presidential election, if you had an audience with the next president, what would you tell them in regards to education, democracy? What should be the plan?
So this is a very critical moment in terms of where we're going to go forward. So in this current book, in the paperback edition, I did a new introduction where I say that this is the equivalent of being in 1876. And I draw from the conversation that Isabel Wilkerson, the author of Caste, had with Taylor Branch, the author of Parting the Waters. He says, where do you think we are? This was in 2018 after a lot of white nationalist acts of domestic terrorism. And they were saying, is this 1950s, is this 1880s? And that framing led me to 1876, which was at the end of Reconstruction. Were we going to continue to move forward towards making this a multiracial democracy, or were we going to go back and hand the country back to the unapologetic white nationalist slave owners. And that is what was at stake in 1876. And we did, in fact, hand the country back. That was a compromise, a closely fought election, 1877 compromise right before the swearing in of the president. The white Confederates and their heirs conceded the White House as long as they could have white people in charge throughout the whole South. And so that is what happened. We pulled the troops out, gave the South back to the Confederates, who put in place legalized, unapologetic, aggressive white nationalism in this country for almost 100 years. The flip side is what the proposition was during Reconstruction. Back to this question, does all mean all? Do we really mean that all people in this country should have quality health care, should have quality education, should have quality housing? And if so, what are we doing that in the richest nation in the history of the world to do things like provide a guaranteed basic income, which Martin Luther King talked about in his final book, as ways to actually end poverty? Can we tolerate poverty in the richest country in the history of the world? Apparently we can, but I would say to the next president and the next political leadership of the country, we have more than enough knowledge, resources, and capacity to provide high quality education, to provide free higher education, to provide excellent education from pre-K all the way through graduate school, if we want to, if we care about everybody, if we truly believe that all means all.
Very good. We are in the year 2024, but back in 2016, you wrote in your book, it was your first book, by the way, Brown is the New White, that the demographic trend suggested that we were moving towards a multicultural future. Do you see that now in 2024?
I absolutely do. And so what I was trying to illustrate, and the reason I wrote the first book was that I really believed that it seemed obvious to me that when Obama won, that it was a continuation and extenuation of the civil rights movement, in that we had, and the results of the work of the civil rights movement, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, the Voting Rights Act, brought millions of people of color into the voting population. The country was 12% people of color in 1965. It's 40% today. And so the composition has changed, and the fundamental electoral calculus has changed. The history of politics and elections in this country has been, used to be a competition between white people, in that progressive whites would contend with more conservative whites around the whites in the middle. There just weren't enough people of color, let alone not being able to vote. There are now so many people of color in this country that the people of color population allied with progressive whites is the majority of people. And that's the majority that elected Obama, that's the majority that re-elected him, and that's the majority that ousted the white nationalists that followed him from the White House. And more important, you see it all across the country, and that's what I try to lay out in the whole second half of my book, is there are multiple examples where we're advancing from places that were formerly bastions of the Confederacy to now becoming multiracial democracy places that are making significant progress. And so I talk about Arizona, Harris County, Texas, San Diego, Georgia, and Virginia. Virginia, a lot of familiarity now with the concept of 1619, that work that Nicole Hannah-Jones had done, and that concept that she had lifted up. The place where African Americans were brought in 1619 is Virginia. Virginia now, through the work of groups like New Virginia Majority of expanding democracy, bringing people of color into the electorate, I talk about that a lot in this book, has changed the composition of the electorate to the point where now the head of the state legislature in Virginia is an African American for the first time in 400 years. So I totally see the trend continuing if we can maintain the imperative around maximizing democracy, maximizing civic participation, having as many people vote as possible.
So how will that trend impact the presidential race?
It's very clear that there are, when I used to practice law, and I had one of my advisors said he could always know what to do by looking at what the opposing counsel was doing and doing the opposite, right? In terms of it being illuminating. The extent to which, and I talk about this in the first book, how those who want this to be a fundamentally white country are better at math actually than progressives are. And they understand that their agenda is a minority agenda. That's why they spend so much time trying to stop people from voting. There's this obsession with voter suppression and stopping people from voting and changing the laws and everything that was done to expand voter participation because they know they don't have the majority. If everybody votes, there is going to be more progressive change. The composition of the electorate is going to be far more reflective. The elected officials will be more reflective of and responsive to the communities of color, and we will continue to move forward. So that's the fundamental proposition in 2024, and that's the strategic imperative for the incumbent administration, is to maximize voter participation, do everything they can, utilize their full bully pulpit to have a crusade for democracy. You should summon CEOs to the White House, have them use their platforms. Every box from Amazon should have a little, here's how you vote, number on the side of it. So this level of crusade, and then that we're going to be up against attempts to stop people from voting. And that's the fundamental proposition. If people vote, if we're able to have maximized the voting, but we will be able to have a president, a Congress that wants to move forward towards making this a multiracial democracy.
Speaking of moving forward, we're here today at this luncheon. We attend things like this because we kind of all share the same core values. We value education. We believe it is important that Black people are educated. What would you say? We talk, we come, we eat lunch, but what is the call to action right now? What's the call?
I think it is to both put in place elected officials. It's our government, and it's our resources, collectively together within the society. And so are we challenging and holding accountable those elected officials to be able to utilize and deploy those resources in a way that are aligned with our highest and best values? And that gets to things like free higher education. It's a very financially doable proposition if we have the right values manifesting themselves through our public policy, is that you can enact both tax on the wealthy, a wealth tax. You can do a 2% wealth tax, which is not even the income, but it's like the money that the wealthy have. And it's not, the average return in the stock market is 10% since the Depression in 1928. So you're not even asking wealthy people to be poorer, just get richer a little slower, and use that 2% of wealth tax can provide for free higher education within this country. If that were a demand that we do, that were a imperative that we were pushing forward. So I think that it's to push our elected officials to be much more bold and visionary and aggressive. We are not constrained by resources, and we are not constrained by the electorate and by electoral consequences. And that's what I've really tried to quantify in both of my books, is that if we put forward a compelling agenda around transforming this country and then do the work to maximize voter turnout, we can do quite revolutionary things from a public policy standpoint.
I have one more question for you, and then we're going to move into our Q&A. So if you have questions or comments, text your questions to 330-541-5794. If you're here with us in person, the 2 mics are set up in the room so you can get your comments and your questions ready. One of the things we reported, talking about political figures, Mayor Justin Bibb, CMSD CEO Dr. Warren Morgan, they went knocking door to door, going to the homes for summer learning, emphasizing that to keep the mind going, to keep your kid educated. Talk a little bit about that in a city like Cleveland, how important that is to see political figures, not just figureheads, but really going out in the streets, door to door, like, hey, we want your kid to learn.
Right, and that's the opportunity that exists, and that's also the challenge we're pushing people to be like that as well, in that level of connection and also the inspiration from it. But it goes both ways. And so when people go door to door, they also hear what the local concerns are, but then we also be able to push and challenge, young people to see what they can actually accomplish. I don't think we're fully anywhere within our society tapping and utilizing the full breadth of support from professionals of color who would want to be supportive, want to be mentors, want to come speak, want to lend their support in different kind of regards. So my father, who was Dr. Phillips, he was the first black doctor in the University Hospital System, and was at Case Western Reserve and did a whole program there in terms of recruiting students of color into medical school there, and then was at Baylor doing a summer school. They had a Saturday school program for high schools where they tapped the medical community and tapped black doctors and doctors of color to then come give talks at that local school. So the capacity, the interest, the support is there, but we have to create the bridges through the different institutions that we have, and also issue the call in terms of asking people to come to be part of these efforts. And the other thing I will mention is that we saw some of the students, some of the young people today. That's an extraordinarily both cost efficient and impactful and powerful piece around what can happen. So can we have different professionals create scholarships so that, and take an interest in the lives of the different young people, so that as they're in high school and as they're looking going to college, they're both connected with somebody who has been a professional and invested in by that person, both literally in terms of their ability to afford college. So that level of interconnection of the professional class and then the young people who need that level of support and inspiration is very possible, and if we would have the intentionality to set up those types of structures to make those bridges.
Be intentional about it all. Oh man, great information today. So right now we're going to transition and we're going to begin the audience Q&A. And for all of you who are watching out there, our live stream audience, good afternoon to all of you. And I am Danita Harris, WKYC 3 News anchor, and I am the moderator for today's City Club Conversation. We are at the United Negro College Fund's Leadership Luncheon, and we have had the honor of, I think, just being fed, mentally and even, emotionally about the passion that Mr. Steve Phillips has. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Brown is the New White, and the recently released national best-selling book, How We Win the Civil War. So we welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, all of you who are joining us via live stream. We are cityclub.org. If you'd like to text a question for our speaker, please text it to 330-541-5794, 330-541-5794. And the City Club staff, they're going to try to get your questions. We have microphones that are up, and if you have a question, we'd like to hear it. And I'm going to go first to Merle, my soror. She has something she would like to say. Merle?
Thank you. I taught school in Cleveland 40 years, so I would love to believe that every teacher loves all our students, but we know that's not true, because sometimes white supremacy raises its ugly head in our schools. And so if you were talking to a classroom of students, so often students want to call teachers racist, which gets them in trouble. How would you advise them to fight back against the racism that we see in discipline and curriculum and so forth without getting in trouble? No, let me take that off. Cancel without getting in trouble. Just how would you suggest that they fight back against the white supremacy that is present in our schools?
Well, I would first let people know that this is not just an issue restricted to our schools. And frankly, as professionals and conscious professionals about racism in our society, it's something you face your whole life and face in every setting. And James Baldwin wrote, like back in the 1960s, says to be black and relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. And what we saw after the killing of George Floyd was the extensiveness of the microaggressions, not so microaggressions, at every different level, in every different job, in every different situation. It's very, very pervasive. So to be able to navigate that, walk that tightrope. And actually, there was a column, which maybe that would be something we could share with people, that was written in the Washington Post in 2007 or 2008 about Obama's tightrope walk. in that, like some people used to say when Obama was running, says, well, he's not as progressive as he could be. And I was telling people that Obama is as progressive as you can possibly be and get elected as a black man in this country, right? And so it's a tightrope that we all have to walk, and it's in levels of disrespect, overlooking, outright, disparaging, et cetera, but we have to fight back in ways that are constructive and keep us in the struggle going forward. So I would say that. And then the other pieces are there, which is an interesting thing. I hadn't really thought about this moment, but we live in a different world now. So I used to work, here's how different the world is. One of my first jobs was working at the Cleveland Plain Dealer in 1983 as a copy boy. And the reporters would type their stories up on typewriters, pull the pieces of paper out, bring them over to me. I put them in a pneumatic tube. They shoot it upstairs. They would lay it out, print it on these huge, printing press pieces, put those on trucks, send those trucks out across the city, deliver them to people's homes. That's how you got information back in the day, and I'm not that old, right? And so, but now what's possible with the internet and the instantaneous ability and social media is that, so when, particularly this plays to classrooms as well, so people are saying things that are incorrect. There are ways to actually lift that up. And I'm just pausing in terms of like, how much trouble is this going to create? But they do this on college campuses where they have this rate my professor thing, right? They have these websites where people actually can give feedback around their teachers and whatnot. So there's more tools now. We're not at the mercy of can we get printed in the paper copy of the Plain Dealer. We can get our voices out, bring other allies to bear, offer alternative points of view, utilizing the spectrum of media that's available to us now.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I have a text question from our audience that I'll read. Cleveland is very proud to be the city of the Stokes brothers, George Forbes, Arnold Pinckney, and others who understood the importance of black political power. How are we doing as a nation when it comes to black political power?
Well, we have ways to go. I mean, those are the reference points and the touch points for, even for my own growth and my development, right? So we lived in Cleveland Heights, right? My dad and my mom got our home well, this is also a relevant point, at our home on Dartmoor Road in Cleveland Heights, which they wouldn't sell to my parents because they were black. So we had to get a white civil rights lawyer, Byron Krantz, to buy the house and deed it over to us. And my grandparents lived on East 128th Street. And whenever we would drive over there, my mom would make a point to drive by Mayor Stokes' house and point it out to us. So as a little child, that had a big impact on me in terms of seeing how that unfolds. And so Cleveland has a very strong and proud and significant history in that regard of advancing that struggle. Many of the key organizers, including Arnold Pinckney of Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign, were from Cleveland, right? Reverend Otis Moss was a key factor, in that effort. And so we have seen in this country, whether it was through the Civil War and Reconstruction, whether it was through the Civil Rights Movement, more recently the George Floyd and the protest around that when African Americans stand up and push for the country to change, and this is what Nicole Hannah-Jones captured in 1619 Project, that's when the country has made its greatest progress in terms of moving towards democracy and inclusion and elevating everybody move forward. Rosa Parks didn't just say, we want to desegregate the buses for black people. They say everybody should be able to ride the buses. When Obama, we elected the first black president, we didn't just say we're going to give health care to black people, so we're going to give health care to everybody. And so that is the tradition that's attached to black political power. It's not invested in enough, and it's not supported enough. And that's partly because there's a tax on it. So we're seeing a lot of this, some of these anti-DEI attacks, the lack of funding. The court's now trying to stop even giving private, for-profit venture capital investments to a black company, trying to say that that's illegal. So we're up against a lot in that regard, so we need to be mindful of the intensity of this fight. And again, then rally the full spectrum of allies that we have and the resource that we have. There are more African Americans, more people of color making six figures, more African American millionaires than there's ever been in the history of this country. So how is that capacity being utilized. The technology is talking about makes people who don't have a lot of money could be harnessed more. So that would probably be my main point. We need to do more to have a strong, steady, consistent funding stream for black political empowerment work, for black leadership development work than we currently do.
Yes. Your turn.
Oh, me.
Yes.
Good morning or afternoon. I had a question regarding the No Child Left Behind. We recognize that education is very fundamental to moving us forward here in Cleveland. A lot of our neighborhoods are reading at a 4th grade level or below. And in my opinion, the No Child Left Behind Act, which changed phonics and writing and arithmetic, and our schools are still leaving our kids behind, and that's a federal mandate. How do we address those changes so that we can see the progress in our young people that we need to see as far as reading and arithmetics?
Well, the first thing I would suggest is that was always time to revisit and update and modernize major public policy initiatives. And so No Child Left Behind is like we're almost 20 years into that endeavor, if my math is right. And it was in a different environment. So one of the things that's not properly appreciated, and you listen to these live different podcasts about 2024 and the elections, and there's this whole sense of what happens if certain outcomes. But the one outcome people don't spend any time at all on is, what if there actually is, which is not an unlikely outcome, a president, a House of Representatives, and a Senate who want there to be significant public policies to make the country more multiracial and more equal. That's a very real possibility. And I would say it's a likelihood that the next Speaker of the House of Representatives is going to be an African American. And so, are we getting ready? So what's the next federal legislation that either builds upon or gets rid of the bad parts or brings in the latest thinking and research around what the federal role should be in education to advance equality, and that we should be putting forward and thinking about and organizing people to have a new federal education policy and initiative that is much better than No Child Left Behind. So the opportunity may well present itself for that, but we need to be ready and having the conversations and marshaling the leaders in education and in the schools of education and in the educational rights lawyers as well. And so being able to bring all those different people together to think about, well, what should the policies be, what should the role be, how do we utilize the vast amounts of federal resources that exist to move them in ways that are more effective than they have been historically.
Yes, sir.
Hello. My question is about Representative Brian Donald says that black families were stronger during Jim Crow era. What do you think about that?
You said that the black family was stronger during the Jim Crow era. Is that correct?
That's what he says, yes.
And they want your response to that.
That's incorrect. Well, it depends how you actually want to look at it. So, and again, there's all these, actually I'm listening now, reading the biography of Frederick Douglass, it's by David Blight, I believe. And so, talking about how there's this whole misinterpretation, selective cherry picking of different like words or phrases or pieces as people, and they tried to do that with Frederick Douglass. It's, oh, well, you know, they're saying, well, Frederick Douglass was a Republican. Republicans were saying this, right? Which he was, yet the Republicans in the 1860s were the party that was against slavery. And the Confederates were literally the Democrats, but we've entirely flipped. And I try to explain how that, well, in my book I talk about it, as the Democrats tiptoed towards racial justice and people of color, Confederate whites sprinted to the Republican Party. So the whole thing has been transformed. So people try to gleam on these different things. Like the fundamental point is it's incorrect and kind of absurd, and we shouldn't spend too much time validating those people who throw these comments out. And these are people who generally have no interest or history or track record in trying to address what's going on in the black community. So in that spirit, I won't say any more about it.
Putting a period on that. We're going to put a period on that. All right. Arian Kirkpatrick.
Hello. Okay, my question is something that just happened recently. I'm in construction, and many of the workers out there see lynches. They see a noose hanging on a job. They're called derogatory names, and they're told all the time, just don't worry about it. Keep working, keep working. And then that it makes my blood pressure go up. Talking to my health professional, she couldn't understand. She said, well, just make it work, and it's okay. And literally, it's not okay, and we know that. But what happened in Spain about 3 days ago, 3 Valencian citizens were charged and put in jail for 8 months for, and I'm going to read it because I want to make sure I get it right. 3 Valencian fans have been handed 8-month prison sentences after pleading guilty to racially insulting the best soccer player in the world, Vinicius Jr., in the first conviction for racism-related cases. The sentence found the defendants guilty of a crime against moral integrity with the aggravating circumstances of discrimination based on racist motives. Do you think that we will ever see something like that here in the United States, where people are charged and there's repercussions for what is racism is a public health crisis? Something needs to be done rather than us just being complacent and ignoring it. And I know we're doing it and we're speaking things like this, but simply living every day being black is a hazard.
Absolutely. I think that's actually a great example. It's a great example of what's possible if we expand our imagination and move with greater conviction and boldness in that regard. And that with all of this, I mean, it's just fundamentally dismaying in terms of just 4 years ago, this month, right? We had the largest set of protests against systemic racism and potentially in the history of this country after the murder of George Floyd. And the level of near consensus about systemic racism being a reality and a problem, something we all have to address with, all the way up to different football games. People had end racism in the end zone, and people on the back of their helmets had end racism. Either we've ended racism, because I don't see that anymore, or the lack of will has dissipated in that regard, which is what happens also in that. This one thing I found when I was researching my book is that they accused Lincoln of the same thing. So he signs the Emancipation Proclamation. We have a civil war to move towards actually trying to incorporate democracy. They accused Lincoln of having Negro on the brain. And so there's actually a picture of him, I think it's if you're on Wikipedia, of a drawing of Lincoln with a top hat, but the top hat is like black people curled up around in the form of a top hat and whatnot. But that's in essence what they're saying about Joe Biden, and saying about anyone who's moving forward around racial justice or DEI or whatnot today, is there's too much Negro on the brain. And so, which is a long way to have been from this near consensus we had about the imperative about doing something about systemic racism. So we need to get back to that, and we need to reground ourselves in and reclaim the imperative and the mantle and the challenge coming out of the Civil War, and that we really had in the context of the period of Reconstruction. Again, back to this concept of does all mean all. In a country that was created, built, made wealthy by the unpaid labor of black people, held in shackles, are we going to incorporate those people, and are we going to then say that racism and discrimination and unequal treatment is illegal, which is the basis of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were passed over great opposition, by the way, including from the President of the United States at the time, the 14th Amendment. And then, but people are not trying to use those to attack the remedies that have been put forward to deal with underlying racism. But the underlying inequality and racism remains a problem. And so I would argue that in terms of how social change happens, how movements move forward, we need to have a broader spectrum of debate, and we need to have a stronger pushing or pulling the country in more of this type of a direction. So there's nothing to stop anybody from introducing a bill in Congress or a legislation in city council or at a school board meeting proposing that acts of racism be outlawed and that people be fined or incarcerated for that. And so whether it passes or not initially, it starts to change the conversation, and it brings that reality into the discussion, and it starts to shift the debate, and shifts the debate more towards accepting and acknowledging the pervasiveness of individual and systemic racism and the unacceptability of it, and focusing on what are we going to do about it, rather than all the current conversation now is how inconvenient the remedies are to people. But we need to start pushing back on that and doing it unapologetically. We can't just like, well, DEI isn't really that, et cetera. No, racism still exists. We want to hold people accountable for that. And here are some suggestions around how to do that. Look at what they did here. They put people in jail for being racist. Can we advance that? Can we take that same bill? What's the underlying legislation they did that enabled that to happen? And can we introduce that into whatever government bodies and to have a press conference around it as it actually gets introduced? That will generate the kind of conversation and dialogue and debate that will help to shift the debate back in the direction I think it needs to go.
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. We have another text question. Cleveland stands as the #1 worst city for Black women. What advice do you give to men and women here to move that needle, and make a change?
I'm sorry, could you read the question again?
Yeah, sure. Cleveland stands as the #1 worst city for Black women. What advice do you give to men and women here to move that needle and make a change?
Well, I think there are other places which would contest for that title, actually. But I think fundamentally it comes back to this issue around multiracial democracy and trying to maximize and be more visionary and aggressive around what is the policy agenda that we're actually trying to move. And so, talked about Carl Stokes in Cleveland offering a model to the country around these types of issues. Housing was a significant issue. Cleveland was a leader in fair housing. That was how my family ultimately was able to get our home in Cleveland Heights. And so, Mayor Bibb has been a leader around things like universal basic income within Cleveland. But can we push those things even further in terms of really turning these cities and counties into really both experiments and models of what multiracial democracy could look like? And so it's a combination of having the political power to do that, which again, maximizing voter participation, making sure as many people as possible vote, and as many people who come from the communities that are most impacted by bad policy.
I read an article, and it was, I think, maybe two years ago from Yale, and there were young students, white, Black, Asian, and the teachers were told to watch the students for misbehavior. The majority of the time, the young Black male was watched. He wasn't just watched by white teachers, by Asian teachers. He was also watched an abundance or a maximized time by also Black teachers. So I think that sometimes with us not even having the same voice, we are not always the best advocates even for ourselves. Because as you stated, for that tightrope that we walk, I have watched my son, after 3 daughters, at some age, he went from this cute little Black boy to a threat in literally 1 grade level. And being an advocate as a mother, I still saw the change of language that was used. And it wasn't only by white teachers, it was sometimes also by Black individuals that sometimes were afraid to speak up because they were sometimes the only one in that position, and then stated that they felt the systematic racism on the other side.
So 100% to that reality. So the question is, how do we change it? And so I really believe that in public, so this has been my experience, in public schools in particular, and particularly public schools with elected offices, that organizing people, particularly the people who are experiencing the system's shortcomings, to project their voice and also try to take power within that system can lead to more systemic changes. There's that, as well as within the schools themselves. Do not discount the power of an insistent, persistent voice around these pieces. As well as I think that in terms of our overall movement, as I mentioned about the opportunities afforded by the technological revolution within the country, is that can take some of the limitations of only fighting these issues in the context of a certain particular school building or classroom and make it a larger struggle, kind of in that vein of the discipline. So my mother passed away in 2018, and we did this tour with my family, and I didn't even know the story my brother was telling us, that he was the first black student at Fairfax Elementary School in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, that the teacher grabbed my brother by the ear. And he came home and told my mom, and then she calls up the school and says, what are you doing? He says, well, I was concerned, whatever. Mom's like, stay right there. My mom drives up to the school, goes to this teacher, grabs her by the ear, right? Says, how does it feel, right?
Yeah.
So I just say that to say that a single individual can make a bigger difference than you may realize. I don't recommend necessarily that course of action. But you can also I'm a witness to getting 20 of your friends together, doing the work of contacting voters, knocking on doors, getting your name out there, running for office, and getting elected. So that's how I got elected in San Francisco. I had 20 friends. We went, knocked on doors. We knocked on 12,000 doors, followed up, and I was able to get into office and bring that voice and those concerns around those different exact types of issues, so that we could actually try to advance systemic changes, policies that would study our children, that would include the study of our cultures within the curriculum, that would actually look at tracking from the higher levels, is there inconsistency in discipline or how are we going forward, that could bring into the schools alternative programs and educational programs for the teachers and staff to understand how to have both positive discipline but also engage students more constructively. But I had the voice as a member of the school board because we had done that organizing to get me into that position. That's a very doable proposition. I would commend to people, as well as the persistence of a determined individual lifting their voice up as well.
All right, the voice that we all heard today, a beautiful voice. Olivia, your question or comment.
Hello. Speaking as a black high school student, and you said, I believe your mother worked in Cleveland Public Schools. As a student at CMSD, I ask, what do you suppose black high school students can do to make a difference in encouraging one another to increase the success rate in higher black education? Because a lot of my peers, as a rising senior as well, don't necessarily know which career paths to take or know the resources that are open to them. So that's my question. Thank you.
Well, I would just say two specific suggestions. I mean, it's a long opportunity. So one is this piece I was saying about Cleveland has a very large and robust community of professionals of color within the greater Cleveland area. And so I think that community can be tapped and perhaps even more unleashed and utilized in terms of things like career fairs or programs where people could come learn about the different types of arenas that are possible and what the journeys that different people took. So I think that those can be organized at a school, those can be organized, schools can get together and do that, and that can provide a certain level of opportunity. The other thing that's got to keep coming back to is that if you're a high school senior, why don't you run for school board? Right? Why don't you get your get friends together at all these different schools, look at how an election actually takes place, what numbers of votes that you actually get, and then both exercise, I continue to believe it is possible to actually win that, but the exercise of organizing, determining an agenda, promoting that agenda across different schools, different parts of the city, pushing that forward, lifting that up, getting that public consciousness is part of what impacts the system overall in terms of being able to get it to be more responsive systemically to the needs of students of color.
Steve Phillips, we thank you. Best-selling author, Cleveland Heights own. We're so glad you're home, and we truly appreciate all of the knowledge and insight that you have shared with us today. And the one thing that I hear in everything that you're saying, get up and do something about it. Lift up your voice, put it to power, and watch things change. That's what we got to do. Thank you so much. And thank all of you. Thank all of you.
Thank you to Steve Phillips for joining us for this special City Club Forum today, and to Danita Harris for moderating the conversation. We would like to thank UNCF for their partnership on today's forum, and we also like to thank our partners at IdeaStream, Public Media, and for producing our live stream and helping us capture this for our podcast and future broadcasts. You can learn more about upcoming City Club forums, including our free outdoor summer series, at cityclub.org. And that brings us to the end of today's special forum. After the forum, Scott Hamilton, Area Director of Development for UNCF in Ohio and North Kentucky, will have some additional remarks. So thanks again to Danita and Steve, and thank you members and friends of the UNCF and the City Club. This forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.